Hello there, capers, and welcome to PodCapers, the official podcast of a place to hang your cape. And this week, once again, it's time for another history lesson. Stop chewing gum in the back. Cue the music! Hello there, capers, and as I said, welcome to PodCapers, the official podcast of a place to hang your cape. My name is Scott James Merridew, and this is the show where we talk about various geek and nerdy topics, and are joined each week by a very special different guest. Now this week, we're talking about superheroes throughout history, and we're joined by, in a place to hang your cape writer, and a guy you might recognise off the Jock and Nerd podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, the Bard!
Hello, I am Bard Brayan.
Hello, how are you doing today?
Not bad. It's a bit early over here in the States, but yeah, it's going to be a good day.
Time zones, what are they for? It's annoying. Now,
Damn the sun.
damn them. Now, so, let's just talk about you for a bit. Tell us all about yourself. What's your life story?
I am a history student at UW Parkside, and I'm also on the wrestling team there. I been in my country's military for my entire adult life now. And, yeah, like comics, superheroes, nerdy stuff like that.
Blimey, wow. You got a lot going for you. Jeez, I just do a podcast. That's pretty much me.
Oh, and I'm ostensibly a writer too, but yet to be published.
What don't you do, man? What don't you do?
Podcasts.
Podcast, exactly. Well, no, you've been on the Jock and Nerd podcast. You subbed in for the Jock, didn't you?
I did. I was the substitute jock, but yeah. I've never made a podcast.
All right. Well, you never know. One day, maybe.
One day.
Yeah. So we got quite a lot of history people on. We had Chelsea Slaughter, she knew a lot about history, and also we had Mark talking about the history of Pokemon, and now we got you. And so you know a lot about superheroes in terms of in a historical context, is that right?
That I do.
Awesome. We're going to talk about that. We're just going to keep it pretty loose, going to go through the ages, as it were. I think it's best to start at the beginning. Years ago, the Earth was a molten mass. Okay, we'll skip ahead a bit from there. It's Greek mythology that we really ought to start with, isn't it?
In the Western tradition, yeah, which is where a lot of heroic fantasy stems ultimately from the Iliad, the Odyssey, and them. But even those were drawing from earlier traditions. If you want to go all the way back, then that would be something like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh yeah, that's that Persian thingamajiggy with the guy with the
Sumerian. Akkadian. The Akkadians wrote the whole narrative, which was based on earlier legends from, like Uruk and places like that.
All right, yeah, and this is about it was Gilgamesh. No, it was the other guy. There was two of them. There was Gilgamesh and this.
And then Enkidu was his buddy that was sent by the gods to, be like, hey, you're being a dick. You need to chill out. And then they wrestled, and then they became friends. And then Enkidu dies.
Aww.
And it was very sad. Mm-hmm.
Oh, jeez. Well, at least wrestling brought them together.
Yes.
As it brings so many other people together.
Such is life.
Such is life, indeed. And so, I mean, that's one of the. It's supposed to be like one of the earliest surviving stories, isn't it?
The earliest surviving epic narrative we have, but if I was a betting man, I would say back in ye caveman times, people were telling stories about the progenitor of their tribe and their clan who led them to their current homeland and taught them the ways of hunting mammoth. Yeah. So it would be people create narratives. Like even you can see that today, the way that like American sports fans will talk about Babe Ruth is they'll speak of him almost like he's a god.
Yeah, the curse of the Bambino.
Mm-hmm.
Can't believe I actually know that, considering I know so little about sports. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, for my shout out to my Chicago Cubs fans is the curse of the Billy Goat, where we, a tribe, in our tribe, we attribute supernatural powers to billy goats. So
Oh,
what are you going to do?
of all the animals, you could have picked the billy goat.
Well, there's a local establishment called the Billy Goat Tavern where, it's a local Chicago spot. So during the 1945 World Series, they were saying the owner, he had his pet billy goat with him, and then he got kicked out, and he was like, yeah, well, the Cubs aren't going to win anymore. And they had not been to the World Series since then until 2016 when
Wow.
we brought it home. Yep.
Wow, what else could it be other than some sort of curse or supernatural thing? Not just a massive coincidence.
Who knows? I'm happy they won.
I'm sure you are. Okay, so that's the so after Gilgamesh, what we
Yeah,
say?
then you.
I mean,
It's everybody did it.
everybody. So there's got the ancient Greeks. I mean, the thing that I keep going to, just from a UK perspective or like a sort of European perspective, is Beowulf.
Yep.
Beowulf. He did quite a lot of stuff. Battled monsters, slept with other monsters, made other baby monsters, and then that baby monster killed him. And Angelina Jolie was naked for some reason.
Do you need a reason?
Well, I like sometimes reasons, just so I can say that I've earned it. I've earned the nudity.
I can respect that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the essence of the superhero is someone who they're more than a man, but they're still less than a god. And then they represent, the best in society, truth, justice in the American way.
Oh yes, because the only way could be American. Jeez. But I mean, this is something I've always found kind of interesting is the concept of demigods. Going back to Greek, because I always thought, like I think a lot of people thought, that demigods were like half gods, descended from the gods, but not really gods. But isn't it true that it's sort of like a type of god, actually?
Sometimes, like you get Heracles, where after his labors and everything he suffered, then he immolated himself and he eventually became, he was raised to the status of a full god. But it depends on the specific tradition, because you have to remember that these were, people's sincerely held religious beliefs. So they operated under a set of rules and principles guiding them. So like something like in, for instance, Roman history, you see Julius Caesar, he was raised to the status of deity by the official state religion after he was assassinated as a way to appease the masses. But even his successor, Augustus, he was later deified. And in Britain, the Emperor Claudius was, as the conqueror of Britain, he was given special place in worship there.
Oh wow! See, I didn't even know that. Wow. The best. I mean, the only other thing that I've heard of something like that happening was in the video games, the Elder Scrolls video games, where like this big hero called Tiber Septim gets made into the pantheon, is given a new name like Talos, and I mean that's the only thing that I can really think of. Are you familiar with the Elder Scrolls?
Yes, I've played hundreds of hours of Oblivion, and then I keep trying to start Skyrim, but then life gets in the way.
Damn life! It's so inconvenient.
Well, there's the special super secret collector's edition on Steam now, so one day.
One day, yeah. It's.
I like Fallout more though, personally.
I suppose
But that's just me.
Yeah, it depends what kind of mood you're in. I suppose I like Fallout, I like Elder Scrolls. I mean, the different mechanics and stuff. If I want a big epic adventure, I go Skyrim. If I want something a bit more small and a bit more personal, I go Fallout.
Yeah, it was New Vegas was another example of, like the superhero is you play the courier, and they take in a lot of that same, like the man with no name, a lot of the old Clint Eastwood Western hero. They fulfill that role in the narrative.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, just one low man on a quest for vengeance.
Yep.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that also that comes into the antagonist of the game, one of the antagonists anyway, Caesar or Kaiser.
Mm-hmm.
He's sort of revered in a certain way, but he also actively worships the god of Mars.
And he claims to be of divine heritage, where he claims to be the son of Mars. Which is interesting because the historical Julius Caesar claimed descent from the goddess Venus.
Oh, right. And see, in those times, how could you possibly contradict that?
Yeah, I mean, people weren't exactly clear on how baby making happened. Even like, they thought like, well, if two guys sleep with the same woman and then she becomes pregnant, then they're both the father, because they were, with the genetic material deposited, they weren't sure how all of that interacted to make a baby.
Oh, now that sounds like a great idea for a sitcom. I pay good money to watch that. It comes a lot. I think a lot for those early stories. It comes back to parentage and things like that. Or I mean, the Greek heroes, they were always either descended or closely linked to some sort of Greek god.
Yep. And then you get even the more human ones like Odysseus, where they're not doing ridiculous feats of strength, is he's still, for the life of me, I can't remember, but he claimed like his grandfather was Zeus maybe, or someone like that, where he was even saying like, I'm not, where it's like Caesar, where he's saying, I'm not the direct descendant of a god, but my family, we're descended from gods.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of, for me, feels like compensating for something. Like Odysseus, mate, you're a military leader. You're one of the greatest military tacticians alive at the time. You single-handedly came up with the plan that defeated the city of Troy. You don't need to make up this bullshit. We like you for who you are, man. Love yourself.
Self-esteem issues.
Yeah.
They'll get you.
Yeah. And but also what I like about Odysseus was the fact that, he sort of claimed some sort of connection to the gods through his heritage, but also he's mostly defined by his opposition to the gods. I think it's specifically Poseidon, who basically makes him lost for like 10 years.
Because that's the other side, is if you get a little too uppity, especially in Greek myth, and you commit hubris, then you're going to draw the ire of the gods.
And that's what I like about the myth of Perseus, because I think that's a great example of a precursor for a superhero versus a supervillain with regards to his, shall we say, battle. I don't know if it's not really that, but let's call it that, with Medusa and the Gorgons. Because I mean, as far as I remember, Medusa used to be a perfectly normal person, but then insulted the gods in some way, so got turned into a horrible snake head lady.
Yep. And she was the only mortal Gorgon, which is why Perseus seeks her out, so he can lop her head off and use it to turn the Ketos into stone and save Andromeda.
Yeah. Well, someone's got to save Andromeda. That latest game was shit. They should have never rebooted Mass Effect.
I haven't played it yet, but I was in GameStop and I was like, all right, I have enough money in the budget this month. I can get Persona 5 or I can get the new Mass Effect. And I was like, well, I have not heard good things about Mass Effect, so Persona it was.
I think by all accounts you made the right choice. I do like Mass Effect Andromeda, but I haven't finished it yet just because I don't really care anymore.
That's very bad for a Mass Effect game.
I mean, I suppose half the problem is just in terms of the character creation and stuff like that. It's very difficult to get your character exactly as you want. With previous Mass Effect games, you could create a character and that would be your character, and then you just play through the game, and then if you want to, you can just redo it. But this new game, it's slightly longer, slightly more open-ended, there's slightly more there, but it feels slightly emptier. So you don't have as much fun just powering through it. At least that's my takeaway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, Mass Effect's always been about your shepherd and their story in the galaxy. It's not about the galaxy itself. It's about you and your crew.
Yeah. And that's part of the problem, is I don't really care much about the crew. I mean, we got a couple of Game of Thrones actors, old Krogan, kind of cool Asari character. That's about it, as far as I can remember.
Yep.
Oh well. So that's Greek mythology. I can't think of any more examples. I mean, there's we could go on and on and on.
You can do a whole podcast about Greek mythology, but
this is something that David,
for our purposes.
Yeah, this is something David Merlovsky would love to talk about. This is his sort of thing, but we won't go into this. So I mean, and there's plenty of counterparts in terms of, as you say, the early Sumerian, Akkadian sort of stuff, and also a Roman mythology.
Mm-hmm.
That's where those Greek get it.
Virgil, the Aeneid, all the way that.
Oh, that good stuff. I think we'll move on now.
Mm-hmm.
So
you've got, medieval chivalric romance.
Yeah, I think the best place to start with that is the Arthurian legends.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do quite like me some Arthurian legends when they're done right. Take note, Hollywood, that latest attempt was stupid! So, okay, I'm just going to do a side rant on this. Ladies, King Arthur and the Legend of the Sword. Right, so it opens with Mordred attacking Camelot, except Arthur is like a little kid. Mordred is supposed to be King Arthur's son. That's one of the biggest things. Did you not pay any attention, Guy Ritchie, to Thomas Mallory or Geoffrey of Monmouth or anyone like that? Did you not think this might be noticeable?
I don't think he did.
I don't think he did either. But I don't know. That's what I like about the Arthurian legends is you can see a lot. It's a lot of the tragedy surrounding lots of superheroes that I see reflected in Arthurian legends. Again, with the familial aspects, because you've got Morgan Le Fay and Mordred, who are all sort of related to Arthur because he basically put it in anything. And plus you've got the whole thing with Guinevere and Lancelot, those two naughty couple.
Yep, it's a shame how all that ended. It would have been so good for England, but oh well.
Oh, yeah, and things never got much better, to be perfectly honest. Oh, dear. Yeah. But because this the problem is that we compare it to superheroes, but it ties in a lot to things like the hero's journey and all those well-known tropes and aspects. You know, like you've got the wise old teacher Merlin, you've got the betrayals, you've got various tasks and challenges that people need to do, like slaying dragons and all that stuff, and quests, Holy Grail. So you can make a lot of comparisons to superheroes, but you can make a lot of comparisons to lots of other forms of fiction.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. All plots have been used time and time again by someone somewhere. It's just more a lot of the variances in, not so much in like, hey, let's get this really, really strong guy who comes in and helps out our people. It's more like, hey, this time he's wearing his underwear on the outside.
Yeah.
That's what resonates with people.
Yeah, although I don't think King Arthur would have been held in such high regard as if he wore his codpiece on the outside of his armor.
No, but even just as an interesting side note to that, there's also, they're not as famous as they are today, but, back in the day, songs of Charlemagne and his paladins were just as popular, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier of projecting superpowers onto historical figures, where like with the Song of Roland, where it was, rather than it became, the Frankish army came in and kind of got its teeth kicked in a bit in Spain, and then this one guy died trying to hold the pass. It was, as they turned tail and ran, it was like, this grand heroic thing where Roland fought off the entire Saracen army with his magic sword and broke the blade and hit it so that the enemy couldn't find it and couldn't use it against Christendom.
Yeah, I think humanity will never find a story that they can't try and improve with a little bit of magic.
Why not? Wizards make everything better.
Yeah, this is true. Wizards make everything better. Tax returns, wizards make it better. Things like that. Yeah, and What's what I was going to say? I don't know that much about Charlemagne. I know of him, and I know that we get the word like paladin from him. You hear that, D&D nerds? It didn't come from you. It came from him. But yes, I don't know that much about that. This is the problem. See, I don't know that much about the interesting parts of history. In history classes, all we ever learned about was like World War One and shit like that.
Yeah, I would argue as a student of history that there's a lot of failing in definitely in the way that I was taught history growing up compared to, how you should actually approach the source material and even like the depth of what you should be looking into and the scope of it all, where like in the States, a lot of times, there's the attitude that history began on July 4th, 1776, and everything before that was a mistake.
Oh, God.
I stole that line from Parks and Rec. Let me be.
I thought that sounded similar, but I'm sure a lot of Americans hold it to be true.
Yeah, where it's you don't. And, they'll gloss over the more unpleasant parts. Like for the U.S., it's the way we treated the natives. And in Britain, I'm sure they gloss over the less savory bits about the British Empire.
Oh, we don't gloss over. We ignore it. We ignore all of it. I mean, we know it's there. It's like it's
it
like
would be undignified to talk about.
Exactly, yeah. It's like that relative that you have that is going slightly in the mind. You don't ignore it. You just try to pretend it's not really there. It's on the periphery.
Yeah, it's you. He walks into Thanksgiving with with nothing but his boxers on, and you just sit there, keep eating with a stiff upper lip.
Yeah. Oh, Uncle Frank, what do you like? We need to talk about this soon. Yeah, it's so many gaps, and there's so much about history that would have been interesting. But I mean, so going forward from medieval times, trying to skip ahead too much. I think again, problem is my perspective is very much rooted in the European stuff. I mean, there's so much stuff in Asia, going back to feudal Japan and things like that. There's so many stories that would have been so interesting to talk to, but I just don't know that much about it.
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of stories from Asia. One of my favorites is the saga of Tomoe Gozen, who was a female warrior during the Genpei Wars, where she was reputed for her great strength and her loyalty to the Minamoto clan and their claim on the shogunate.
Wow, that's
fun story, stuff like that.
Wow, so what happened there? I want to know. Tell me.
She fought for, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure she fought for and was the lover of Minamoto no Yoshinaki. And so initially they won out, they defeated their rival clan. But then there was splinters within the Minamoto clan, and ultimately his ambition got the better of him, and he lost out and was killed. And then she herself is lost to history, but there's legends like she became a Buddhist nun afterwards. Some say she killed herself to follow her lord into the afterlife, but there's not a definitive answer.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, crikey. Yeah, that sounds so interesting. But again, I don't really hear about this sort of stuff. I mean, I grew up reading stories about Robin Hood and things like that, and he's one of the much more easily defined, not archetypes. I want to say something like ancestor. I can't remember the exact word.
He's an English folk hero where, he stole from the rich, gave to the poor. He had, supernatural skills with a longbow.
And everybody loved him, and he was really involved in the Crusades, depending on which version you read. And because we could see the clear parallels between him and Green Arrow. I mean, he was pretty much based on him. He even had the same hat, which was, I mean, just stupid looking even back then. But yeah.
It's even across the pond. We have a character, Hawkeye, from the novel Last of the Mohicans, where he's, a frontiersman famed for his marksmanship.
Oh, right, okay. And that's another thing I like, is that they're always versions of other characters throughout different cultures. I mean, again, this goes back to sort of the Greek and Roman things. There were so many parallels between the Greeks and the Romans that you could pretty much interchange most of them, if not all of them.
And to continue on the sharpshooter theme, later in American history and the history of the American frontier, you have characters like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday that were, the gunslingers, where they were famed for their skill with a revolver in this case, where it was that same marksman, citizens, frontier hero archetype.
Yeah, and then Wyatt Earp got cursed and Doc Holliday got thrown in a well for all eternity.
Yep.
I love Wyatt Earp.
And then we got a pretty good... Oh, really? That's... Okay, more people know about that. I'm glad it's not just me.
Oh, so I finally found someone else who knows the show, thank God!
I can't wait for season 2 to drop on Netflix.
I mean, I've already seen season 2 just because I found it on the internet. I'm a naughty boy, but it's so good, and we're getting season 3. It's...
Yes. All right, that's good news.
Yes.
I knew it was going to be a good day.
Oh, damn, yeah. But going back to what you're saying about, like, the American frontier and that sort of thing, I like about it because I don't know that much about it, but I like how, because it's the sort of place where the tall tales really got started. Like, it's sort of the classic archetype. What's that guy? The guy who's really tall, the big guy?
Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan, that's the one. Where his story is just...
Babe, his big blue ox that pulled the road straight.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Pulled the road straight.
He had a blue ox that pulled...
Named Babe. Pulled the road straight.
Okay. Sure.
Yep.
You know what? That's not the weirdest thing we're probably going to talk about on this show. I don't know why I'm singling this out.
Yeah, it's... tall tales. Or then you have John Henry, who he smashed his way through a mountain and ultimately died one-upping the steam drill.
Oh, okay. Wow. See, these sort of things, they remind me of, like, old British folklore, like Finn the Giant. I don't know that much about him. He's like an Irish giant who gets into a lot of scrapes and... massive guy and tricks a lot of people and gets into scrapes, usually involving his wife. Actually, so I think that's where these sort of things began. It's sort of in folklore, things like that. But then they go, because obviously a lot of immigrants coming from Europe over to America, they bring these sort of ideas of these sort of tales with them, and then they evolve and become these tall tales.
Yeah, that's how things like that happen. And just as an interesting side note on superheroes in Irish folklore, there was the hero Cuchulainn, who he's renowned as being almost supernaturally fair. He was, a skilled warrior, yada, yada, yada. But what makes him stand out is he had, when he would get angry, he would enter what, I might butcher the pronunciation, but it was called the Riestrad, or it's most often translated as warp spasm, but I doubt that's a good translation. But what he would just grow huge and monstrous, and just, he'd be so angry that he would attack anything. And you can see that. And then, I haven't done the scholarship to draw a connection between that and the Incredible Hulk, but, you can at least see the common idea of, rage making you so powerful and so blind that you can smash your way through friend and foe alike.
Yeah, I mean, because I like the idea that they're giving them an actual name. What we say, because that reminds me of things like Goku going Super Saiyan.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say that he's basically a superhero, and I'll say sure because I don't know anything about Dragon Ball.
Yeah, I could see that, where he embodies a certain a warrior ideal. And in the dub, he gets made out to be a lot more just overall heroic in a classically Western sense. But in Japan, it's the idea of defeating a strong opponent is still... there's a very long tradition of that in their folklore, especially in samurai stories and the like. And then you can see the evolution of that tradition where, Son Goku is more than a man, but sort of still less than a god. In a lot of the newer installments, he's, you know, fighting gods, literal gods, but he's ostensibly not a god. Okay, well, technically he is now, but that's that's a whole other thing. But for most of the story, more he's mortal for all intents and purposes, and he, holds up this idea of the warrior proving that he's the strongest.
Oh, right. See, I find that interesting because in a lot of Western stories of these sort of nature, often the heroes are much nicer and much more true and brave, and they try to make them a bit more human and a bit less godlike, but in doing so, they make them actually less human because they're more one-dimensional. And I think it's in other cultures that actually, when they become a bit more, not necessarily monstrous, but a bit like that, they become much more interesting.
Where they have, because a lot of the Western tradition draws from Christian teaching, and it draws from like the Arthurian legends and the tales of Charlemagne are all directly an attempt to impose or to promote a certain way of thinking and a certain standard of behavior where it's, there's a certain level of humility that's expected of you, whereas, like in Greek and in the Greek and Roman tradition, the religious imperative was to achieve a certain level of excellence and to demonstrate how incredible you were, which is part of the reason why hubris was such a big deal, because it was this, you're supposed to be more than a man, but don't go start thinking that you're a god.
Yeah, otherwise you get burned. I think there's one that I know of, exception to this, and there's sort of a medieval concept, and that's the character of, I can't remember if is Reynard or Reynardine? Can't remember.
I don't actually know.
I don't know why, because I think he's a French character, possibly English wise, one or the other, and he's a fox character. He's part of a group of anthropomorphic animals, but he operates not on necessarily being brave and true and honest, but actually through trickery. He's a very emblematic trickster character, and he usually wins by tricking the other characters. And I find that interesting that and amongst. Because Robin Hood sometimes uses a little bit of deceit, and Robin Hood is very connected to Reynard in that regard, to sort of win the day. But he mostly wins just by, I'm Robin Hood, laugh with me, merry man, ha 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 ha. Whereas Reynard is slightly darker in that regard. He's definitely on the side of the angels, but even then, sometimes
He'll get his hands dirty.
Yeah, and I find that kind of interesting.
I don't know that much about the character, but then that I would say that it draws on more of like a tradition of the downtrodden, where they're, getting one over on the man.
Yeah, because everyone loves an underdog story.
Oh yeah, especially in America.
Oh yeah. And another thing that's where we get the archetypal Wild West stories. Is usually like the sheriff taking down a gang of vicious thugs who are terrorizing a town and things like that.
Yeah, that's more bandits, and then regrettably in a lot of early Western cinema or Western movies, it was the natives. But it's still that idea of the common man conquering the frontier and nature itself for, to creating a homestead for his family, where that's the idea. And then, sometimes you have to be a little wily to get there.
Yeah. This sort of goes into like the 1700s, 1800s, where humanity was really starting to change a big way in terms of a political military front because of the Napoleonic Wars. And this isn't a historical character, but it's a character that's very prominently figured in that. In fact, there's a lot of very interesting historical characters that we really like. Like there's Sharp and Horatio Hornblower. Don't laugh, it's his real name. But the character I want to talk about that sort of embodies the superhero aspect is the Scarlet Pimpernel.
Yeah.
Because you see it, like, you see a lot of... This is when we really start to see the connections between superheroes coming in. Like, he's got a secret identity. He does. People don't know who he really is. He goes on daring feats. Does he have a costume? I can't remember if he has a costume.
Maybe not a costume, but an iconic outfit.
Yeah, definitely. And
like Zorro.
Zorro. We'll get to Zorro. We'll definitely get to Zorro.
Oh, yeah.
We got stuff. So I've got stuff to say about Zorro. But I thought that was interesting because the Scarlet Pimpernel, he goes off to basically prevent French nobles from getting their heads cut off by a couple of bit too over-eager aristos.
Damn you, Robespierre.
Yeah. You think you're solving problems, but you're not. You're creating more, you damn French idiot. I'm sorry. English prejudices, they come up a bit. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
England does get a bit cocky about its revolution.
Yeah, well, because, I mean, Napoleonic Wars is a big thing, and it did influence our culture quite a bit. Again, these aren't...
Oh, everything.
Oh.
That was one of the great turning points of Western civilization.
Because again, these aren't historical figures, but they're more recent novels. The character of Sharp, who was a enlisted soldier in Napoleonic Wars, gets promoted to officer. You might have heard of the miniseries or television episodes with Sean Bean.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
he doesn't die in those.
No, he doesn't. Funny enough. It's so weird. And let's be honest, he's in the middle of a war with people like getting blown up all around him. It's actually kind of surprising that he makes it through it. And then, he's of a slightly lower class, which is why it's so impressive that he made his way up the ranks. And he's sort of he's a great archetype of the British everyday working man who's a career soldier. He's tough. He's square-jawed. He's from London, at least in the books. I think in the series, he's actually from Yorkshire because that's where Sean Bean is from, or at least that area. And he couldn't do any other accent at the time, at least. But then you've got the character of Horatio Hornblower, and again, he had his own books and his own miniseries starring, I'm going to get this wrong, Owen Grufford, Mr. Fantastic, the guy who played Mr. Fantastic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Whatever you say, man.
Yeah, but he was, I don't know how to say his name. He's Welsh, but he was very different because he was upper class. He wasn't an enlisted man. He was straight off an officer. And he did earn his way through the ranks again, but he was a naval officer, and he was very upper class. And these are the sort of the two archetypes that I think really resonate. It's basically, sort of, in terms of thematic levels, Batman and Superman. Sharp is like Batman. He's a bit dark. He's a bit more gritty, a bit more tough. Superman is a bit more like Hornblower. He's a bit more righteous and true and a bit more shiny. Although Batman is... he's not exactly lower class, let me put it that way.
No, that's actually a common thing in a lot of these pulp stories that emerged late 19th, early 20th century, where they'll be, a person of high status by day, but he goes out and associates with the lower people in his guise. Like Zorro is a Don in California. Batman is... old money type. Or then even Robin Hood in most tellings is the Earl of Locksley, where he's a noble who's robbing nobles for the sake of the common man. Or if you wanted to go even further back, you have guys like Julius Caesar, who he was a populari. He was a man of the people despite being born a patrician, where they straddle the line between the two worlds.
All right. Yeah, I like the whole duality of it all. I mean, the big thing over here in Scotland, I live in Edinburgh, is Deacon Brodie, who unless I'm very much mistaken, was an actual historical figure. Deacon Brodie was, I think he was a locksmith or the maker of locks, or basically made security systems of the time. And he was very well liked, very well respected, very much a man about the town. At night, he used to go into people's houses and steal stuff. He had this whole double life going on, eventually caught and hanged. But that was the inspiration that Robert Louis Stevenson had for Jekyll and Hyde. The whole how you could be one person during the day and one person at night. And this is when really it sort of started with Scarlet Pimpernel, but also the secret identity thing and the duality nature, as you're saying with the Hulk, things like that, those two aspects coming together. But then things had a bit of a turn. Before we get to the pulp stuff, we've got the Victorian era, and the Penny Dreadfuls aren't the best example of this, but there's a couple of things in there that kind of noting, like Dick Turpin, very well-known English highwayman. His exploits, if you will, got sensationalized, fictionalized, and popularized very much in the Penny Dreadfuls, the old cheap magazines they used to churn out. And again, is a great example of, I think, the best example of a precursor of an anti-hero. Because he did bad things, he robbed people, but people still kind of loved him. All the men wanted to be him, and all the women wanted to sleep with him.
Could be. I'm not familiar with the character, but that sounds like it.
Yeah, I guess he basically went around robbing people's stagecoaches, stand and deliver, and all that stuff. And yet people really liked him. I mean, there were a lot of very popular highwaymen back in the day, and a lot of people, even when they got killed and hanged and stuff, they were like, really, like, actually, we kind of like this guy because he's so much fun, because they were witty and charming. And it's great sort of anti-heroes, because people like those sort of things. But then, in the sort of later Victorian period, things really started to change. And we started to evolve, at least over here in Britain, we started to look a bit more inwards, be a bit more introspective, and our sort of superheroes became much more articulate and much more intelligent, and they used their minds to solve things. And we all know where I'm going for this, Sherlock Holmes.
Ah, yes, I love me some Holmes.
Who doesn't? I tell you who, me when I watch Sherlock.
You don't like Sherlock?
I used to, but I've grown out of it now. I've listened to a lot of other people's opinions on it, and honestly, they've swayed me. David Molosky, you'll know what we're talking about. It's not that good anymore.
Well, it's over now, but
yeah, pretty much. I don't know if they will come back. I don't know, but I don't know. I don't really like it anymore. I honestly, even though I don't watch that anymore, I slightly prefer Elementary.
I did enjoy that. I didn't keep up with it though. Is it still going?
I think it is still going. I think that's the thing with American television. If they have something that's selling and working, they'll never stop. They'll never stop. Oh God.
Sometimes to our detriment, I think, but
yeah,
it was. I love me some Lucy Liu though, so I'll take it.
Yeah, good for you. But that's what I like about him. There were so many other examples of his sort of thing. I mean, there was sort of rip-offs along the way. There was, I think Sexton Blake was one. He was a bit later than Sherlock. He was a private detective. Well, he was a detective in any case, and used his mind and stuff was very similar to Sherlock Holmes. I think he got a bit of criticism for that.
It's the gentleman detective hero.
Basically, yeah. But then there was
Poirot.
Poirot, yeah. So that was a bit later in the 1920s. I love me some Agatha Christie. Poirot, Miss Marple, things like that. Again, this sort of very normal person, but did such great things using merely the power of the little grey cells. But on the flip...
Well, it's a proper English gentleman does not get his hands dirty.
Yeah, well, Poirot was Belgian, but the same concept applies, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, although Sherlock Holmes, he did sometimes, like, he knew how to box and stuff. I mean, that scene in the Guy Ritchie movie, that was not out of nowhere. That was something that he could genuinely do. And so he did embody the physical aspects, but he relied on the intellectual aspects, which I thought was always interesting. But then you got the flip side of that with characters like A.J. Raffles and Arsène Lupin, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who again were very intellectual people, but they're not gentlemen detectives. They were gentlemen thieves.
The cat burglar.
Yeah. And again, it's the sort of how we like the bad guys, even if they're doing bad things, because they're sort of good in the end, really, aren't they? And I just find it kind of interesting because, again, not physical. They relied on their wits and their guile, and there was always people out to catch them, but they never did. In fact, it sort of reminds me a bit of just sort of like cartoons, like later cartoons, where you've got these characters like Bugs Bunny doing naughty, raffish things, and you know, you got Elmer Fudd trying to shoot him, and you don't root for Elmer Fudd, but at the same time, like, you can kind of see Elmer Fudd's points sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Tweety Bird is an asshole.
Tweety Bird is kind of an arsehole, yeah, not enough people say that. But then, we get the turn of the century, and then we get the sort of the last of these sort of gentleman things, Zorro. Now, I fucking love Zorro.
As you should.
As well I should, yeah, even... Okay, I was about to say even that second movie they did with Antonio Banderas.
Not great.
No, it's not that great, no. Oh, God. Oh, I'm getting flashbacks now. The horse was drunk! Why was the horse drunk? I'm sorry. But, yeah, but so you talk about he was, in his later life, he was a Don, he was a man about town, and then at night became Zorro, the fox. And let's just say this, I mean... They say that he was inspired by Zorro, but let's be honest, Batman is a rip-off of Zorro.
Yes.
Being a rip-off. It's...
Well, Zorro's a rip-off of Robin Hood. That's everyone. That's the history of literature. Everyone ripping someone off.
Yeah. But they try to cover it for saying, oh no, he was inspired by Zorro. Like, no, he saw a character and he took it. But there was so many pulp stuff going on back then. And I'm not sure if this really counts, but it sort of ties into the Greek mythology bit, just the sort of the fantasy setting with things like Conan the Barbarian and Kull the Conqueror and people like that. These larger-than-life people who do these great feats. But again, we're going back to that moral ambiguity thing. They were not always very good people.
Nope.
No. And this led to... sort of the quintessential forerunners of the modern day superhero as we know them today. Like the literal last step before we got to them, the pulp heroes, the big physical action heroes like Doc Savage and Bulldog Drummond.
Yep, and then you've got guys like the Shadow, who they were even, you know, an even more direct thing Batman was ripping off from.
Oh yeah. That is we're here now. This is when superheroes, as we know them today, in their sort of first modern incarnation, fully appear with the Shadow. Now, that was originally a radio play, wasn't it?
I don't remember off the top of my head. It could be though, because that was when radio was starting to get big.
Yeah, it was first a radio show. At first, he wasn't the actual main character. He was like the narrator of several other different stories. And it was narrated initially by Orson Welles. This is when he was first starting to get really popular, and that's when he was involved in radio. So that's how it shows just how big it was. Because people, I mean, on the one hand, they're not taken as seriously as they are now, but people were still listening to this show. It wasn't just for the kids. People were like turning into like, now on KWB News Radio, it's the Shadow Hour. No. The Shadow steps through the lonely alleyway and faces off against his opponent. That sort of thing. And this is when it really starts to expand. And we get it starts off in radio, but then it starts to go into the comics. Now, again, this is why I mentioned the Penny Dreadfuls, because this sort of cheap, quick and easy, getting them out there sort of format. Again, sort of in the pulps, but not as much. That's what really influenced things like, not necessarily the Shadow, but things like the Phantom and Mandrake the Magician, people like that. This is when it really starts to take off. Do you know? I don't know much about these characters except for, you know, the Phantom had that movie in the 90s with Billy Zane that was silly, so silly.
Oh, I don't know much either, to be honest. It's a gap in my knowledge, but. You know, I recognize that they had a very large impact. Like, Batman was created as a bridge between pulp heroes and superheroes.
Basically, because this goes back to the whole idea of Batman being a detective, which he isn't, because all he ever does is take a piece of evidence from a crime scene and plugs it into the Batcomputer, and the Batcomputer does it for him. He just has a hyper-advanced version of Google. I'm sorry. Again, I come from the land of Sherlock Holmes. I find the idea of Batman being a detective insulting, unless it's in something
Well,
like.
he's more of a detective in the American sense, where you've got the hard-boiled PI, not so much like the gentleman detective, but more of like, the guy on the street where if he has to rough up a mobster, it's
Yeah.
sometimes that's what you have to do to get to the truth.
Yeah, there is a lot of elements of Raymond Chandler in there, so again, it's sort of what I like about like Philip Marlowe and characters like that is they're a mix of the intellectual detective thing like Poirot and Sherlock Holmes, and also the slightly more action hero stuff like Bulldog Drummond, just simply because it's a mesh of the two, and that's how we get characters like the Batman, as you say, and 1930s. So that's when Superman comes along. This is the golden age of comics. The golden age. And we get things like the original Human Torch, people like that. But it's not until the 1940s when things really take off, because that's when a little thing called World War II happened. And suddenly, hey, these comic things that the kids like? We could use them for propaganda!
I don't know, a guy in a star-spangled outfit punching out Hitler on the issue. I mean, is that really propaganda, do you think?
Nah, it's probably fine.
I'm skeptical.
Yeah.
No, you do get and then that goes back into the idea of superheroes representing the best in society, especially in the United States. It was part of that larger push against the fascist ideology, where you get like the same vein that made the Joe Louis, Max Schmeling fights such a big deal. That was the same thing that made Captain America such a big deal, where it even before the U.S. was directly involved in the war, it was a thing about, this is about our ideas of democracy and personal liberty against this idea of fascism and a one-party autocratic state.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically Rocky versus Ivan Drago, basically.
Yes.
It's that idea. And it worked. It worked. People love that sort of stuff. But after World War II was over, people still kind of stuck around for the comics. And that's when we get the prototype Flash, Green Lantern, not the ones we know today, like the old ones, like the guy with the cape and the guy with the tin hat. And I know actually one that did have a staying power, Wonder Woman, that was created by a sex maniac psychologist.
William Moulton Marston is a god among men, and I will not have you insult his honor, sir.
I do apologize. He was into bondage.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
And he didn't officially, but he had two wives, who also each had a wife.
Oh wow! I didn't know that. Yeah, I know there's a movie. There's a movie coming out about him. I think it's called William Moulton Marston and the Wonder Woman or something.
Yep. Yeah, where he had his wife, and then he had another woman who they all lived together, and and she had kids, and where did they come from? Nobody knows. Let's not ask questions. And then and then he passes on, unfortunately, and they just stay living together and, don't go about their business and,
How very modern,
Yep.
How very Nelson, Horatio Nelson, very nice. And then, we're skipping ahead, we're racing forward now. We go into the 1950s, and this is when... This is a very weird period for me, just because I don't know that much about it. I know this is a time when a lot more female superheroes were coming around. Before they were always like the helpmates, as we discussed in the episode with Chelsea Slaughter and things like that. But now we're getting a lot of, there's a lot more female superheroes, but they're always derived from superheroes like Supergirl and Batgirl and things like that. So I don't know that much about it, that time period.
Well, part of it, the big thing that happened in the 50s for comic books was an idiot who'd never read a comic book wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, where he alleged that comic books were turning boys into homosexuals and that they were a conspiracy to subvert American values in the name of gay communism.
Oh my god! Wow!
I'm being more than a bit hyperbolic, but that's the general gist of it. Was they considered comic books to be subversive material, which led to the infamous Comics Code.
Oh joy!
Because
Oh
this was
god!
in the U.S. This was the Red Scare, where everyone, the start of the Cold War, where everyone was worried about communist spies coming over and taking away our democracy and our freedom. And so there was a larger push in American culture towards a very romanticized view of what it means to be American, where you get, it's a lot of the social norms that had existed in the 1910s, maybe, they collapsed under the weight of the First World War, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and then World War II, where, the idea of the women staying at home and raising the family and all of that had just been shattered.
Yeah.
And so there was a concerted effort to put it back together and to get back to business as usual. And one of the casualties of that movement was comic books, which, until then were a lot more flavorful than, I would argue even than they are today, where like the Comics Code killed horror comics in the mainstream for a long time.
Yeah, it wasn't until like Marvel got like a not Tales from the Crypt. Was it Tales from the Crypt? Or something like that. It was like that big horror thing they brought, like Dracula and Blade and things like that. That was in like the 1970s. It was a while until we brought stuff like that back.
Yeah, where it very nearly destroyed comics as a medium. And then that's what led to the Silver Age, where you get, morally upstanding heroes who, like, oh, Batman would never use a gun or kill anyone. That would be, naughty.
Yeah.
And, Superman, he's this Boy Scout from Kansas. And then
he defeats supervillains with hostess fruit pies.
That's where a lot of the early Supergirl stories were, in a way, Superman chiding Supergirl. I mean, like, no, you're being, this isn't how young girls are supposed to act. And then her being like, oh, you're right. I'm silly. I'm just going to go back to the kitchen.
Oh, God. Yeah, this is when Superman comics basically like with that stuff, but also like one episode, oh no, Superman is fat. Oh no, Lois Lane is a centaur.
Yeah, where that Silver Age weirdness and they became really campy and really boulderized and sanitized, and there was a concerted effort to make them like not just G-rated but like something more less mature than G-rated.
But this is when we get to the 1960s, and this is when I think things start to get interesting. Both because this is when things... we don't just got comics, we've also got television. Because before we only had comics on television and maybe like a couple of film serials.
Radio serials.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the Superman radio serial actually is where Kryptonite comes from.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Oh. So they're the one that came up with that Deus Ex Machina. Well done!
Indeed.
God, but the thing I like to point out is the best example of the 1960s. Like, there were two camps for me in the 1960s: those trying to hold on to the 1950s, and those looking forward to the future. Now, I think there's two examples of this. The ones looking back for me were DC Comics, but also the Batman television series. It was fun, it was campy, it was a little bit 60s in terms of its, flavor, but less so in terms of its thematic element, shall we say. And then on the other side, on the looking forward to the future side, you've got Marvel, who are introducing all these new and different characters. Still a lot of progress to me, but they're trying to make things a bit different. They're skirting the boundaries of the comics code, but also there's this television series, The Green Hornet. You ever see that?
I haven't seen it so much, but a bit here and there.
Because it's a great doppelganger to the Batman TV series, because they were both superhero shows, both had crime fighters, they wore costumes, they both had sidekick, Batman had Robin, Green Hornet had Kato, played by a younger Bruce Lee, but Batman was silly and goofy and like na 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 Batman. And not that you can't like that show. It's fine to like the show, but Green Hornet was much darker. Green Hornet's about a character. Again, he's a man about town. I can't remember his name, but he's a playboy. He's like owns a newspaper and stuff. But by night, he's a superhero. Only is he because he pretends to be a criminal, going by the name of the Green Hornet. But actually, he's working to subvert and take down criminals. And it's very much ahead of his time in that way. I think there was like the radio series before that and stuff, but this is something that really pushed it to the forefront because it was sort of competing, at least I think it was competing, against the Batman show. And you have these two very different things, one looking back and one looking forward. And this, I think, set the tone for the rest of the decade. Certain projects were going forward and trying to be new and different and, evolve. And other things were trying to stay exactly the same.
Yeah, which that goes back to the larger culture clash where after the change in the early 19th or the early 20th century, there was an effort to set things back the way they were. But then as people who, as the next generation came along and they started asking questions and trying to explore the world, then you get, the flower children and you get the, the hippie movement and the anti-Vietnam movement where everything starts changing again, even, and a lot of the older folks were, they're like, God damn it, we just got this put back right, and now you're trying to break it again.
Yeah, counterculture, man. And that, I was glad you mentioned that, because leading into the 1970s, this is when comics, I think, pretty much just, gave up trying to look back and started to look forward. Even DC caught up eventually. Although, because, Marvel really was I think that they were the first, if not definitely first, one of the first.
Marvel, you had this minor figure in comics history, Stan Lee, where he started writing. And a lot of what he was writing, looking back, it could be considered, it was the kind of subversive thing that gave What's-His-Face with Seduction the Innocent nightmares, where he, the X-Men was about the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And it was about not judging, not discriminating against people due to the circumstances of their birth. You had black superheroes. You had Black Panther come along, where he was the first major black superhero. And, you had Spider-Man, where rather than being these monolithic figures of myth and legend, you had teenage Peter Parker who was struggling to pay the rent and who had very human problems, where, you start getting a peek under the hood, and you start taking a closer examination on superheroes as human beings and what, where it's like, oh, maybe being a vigilante crime fighter by night, kind of is going to mess with your day life. Yeah. Where, you're going to be a bit tired the next day if you don't sleep at all.
Yeah. I think one of the, there's two great examples I like to look at this. One, both of them Spider-Man. One is that I think it was one of the last Spider-Man comics that Jack Kirby ever drew. Was it Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko? Steve Ditko did the first one, but it was one or the other. And I remember because I used to read all these old ones all the time, and it was this. It was the end of the issue. Spider-Man had just come back from defeating a supervillain, but he'd also had a lot of, troubles in his personal life because Betty Brant was kind of into Ned Leeds, and there was a little bit of romantic tension there. And then he sees this mannequin that looks like the head of a mannequin, like a department store mannequin, and it looks a lot like Ned Leeds. And he just says, "You know what, Ned Leeds, I fucking hate you," and he punches it. And he doesn't use I'm not literally, I may be exaggerating, but that's the first example of the darker stuff that really got on. Because let's be honest, in the 1950s, no hero would have done that.
Nope.
No hero would have looked at an inanimate object and said, "You know what, you remind me of a guy I hate, I'm going to hit you." It wouldn't have happened. But the second thing that I think really, really set the tone, for the 1970s especially, is the subplot involving Harry Osborn and the drugs.
Which is what broke the back of the comics code.
Yeah, and the reason why I love this, I think I might have mentioned this before on this show, but the reason why I love this is because DC at the time said, "Oh, we'd never do anything like that. No, we would always operate within the comics code." And then a couple of years later, the comics code said, "Okay, you know what, if you don't want to do a drug thing, that's fine." And then Green Arrow's sidekick, Speedy, gets on heroin. I think we all saw that coming by the name, but still. And so, yeah, Marvel broke the back of the comics code. That's pretty much done at this point. DC eventually, day late and a dollar short, do the same. And then we got all these slightly darker things. A lot more female superheroes, a lot more non-white superheroes. Lots of counterculture stuff. Again, in Spider-Man, we get the whole thing with the Vietnam War with Flash Thompson and how it might not be actually this very good thing. And when you read these comics, because I remember as a kid reading these comics, reading the 1960s comics and then reading into the late 60s, early 70s ones, and how different they are, it's amazing. But then we got the 80s when things just went silly.
The Dark Age.
The Dark Age, indeed.
Every writer was trying to be Alan Moore, and they're not anywhere near Alan Moore's level.
Yeah, and every artist was trying to be Rob Liefeld when we didn't need even the one Rob Liefeld. Jeez. Oh, God. I mean, we got a lot of good stuff. I think, actually, DC really upped his game, especially with Batman and things like that.
Yeah, I would say that was sort of a renaissance for DC after, they spent most of the Silver Age kind of dicking around and not putting out much of note. Then you had The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. They brought a lot of new life back into the company and into, revitalized their storytelling and their efforts and, and their literary ideas. It brought, it kind of went off in a bad direction, but for a while for a bit, it got the company back where it needed to be.
Yeah, I mean, Marvel was off doing like Cable and Deadpool and all these like big masterly brawny guys, and a lot of independent stuff going on as well. But DC, they were doing a lot of things with Batman and stuff like that. I mean, it began with things like that I can't remember what it's called, The Long Halloween. No, what was that? Oh, something to do with Halloween and the Killing Joke and things like that.
The Long Halloween was
The
one
Long
of
Halloween.
them.
That's it. But it ended on something that I actually read recently because there's an animated movie coming up, like an adaptation of it, Gotham by Gaslight, which is one of DC's first Elseworlds stories. I don't know if that predates Marvel's What If. In fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't. But there's these sort of examples of taking these heroes and putting them in other scenarios. I think X-Men did this first when they did. I think it was like Kitty Pryde telling Ilyana Rasputin, Colossus's younger sister, a bedtime story, a fantasy bedtime story that featured all of the X-Men. And I find this so interesting because all of these heroes are influenced by previous decades and previous historical years and folklores and things like that. And now they're going back to that folklore and influencing themselves in a way and reinterpreting themselves. And we're just in a never-ending loop of using these characters in different scenarios.
Well, that was also the time that comics started to become a niche. Whereas before, you'd go to a newsstand to get the latest issue of Batman, Now it was specialty shops, and you had, the market as a whole started to cater more towards a comic fan base versus people. And it became where then you got stuff like Crisis on Infinite Earths, where you had a lot of the point of doing it and a lot of the enjoyment that was derived from it was in, you could only get the most out of it if you had been reading comics for, since Spider-Man was in high school.
Yeah.
And then that's, and then there was a lot of, there was a lot of artistic merit to doing that, but it also marked one of the last times that comics as themselves, like comics, the physical books were a major force in American culture.
And this is when, there's the whole, on the flip side of that, going back, you have to read these things for years and years and years. But on the flip side of that, this is when we start seeing what I like to call the Great American Graphic Novel. And things like that, with Alan Moore and Watchmen, but also Will Eisner especially, and things like that. And comics, and we're drifting away from superheroes and talking about the format as a whole here. Just became more insular and more literary, shall we say. They'd always been, because we're talking about all these characters, these ideas and archetypes repeating. But this is when people start really to notice that and take advantage of that. And then we're starting to get into the modern era now, and I think we won't go into the 1990s and the current day, because then we'd be here forever talking about what we like and what we don't like, and how superheroes have exploded in popularity, things like getting remade and rebooted and blah, 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 blah. I think the point is, and you said it before, and if you hadn't done, I would have said it, nothing's new. Everything's the same. Everything keeps repeated over and over again. But that doesn't mean we can't enjoy them. That doesn't mean we can't come up with, make things seem new. And we can take influence from other cultures and stuff. With many Western stories have taken influence from Eastern ones and vice versa. I'm sure many British stuff has taken advantage of American things, and again, vice versa. So we can all I think the takeaway from all this is read as many stories as you can and learn from them. Find out what works, what doesn't, and just keep reinterpreting in a way.
Yeah, that's how we move forward as culture. It's, if you have an idea, a good way to express that is to have a hero that represents that idea. And, you've got Robin Hood, who represents, power to the people. You've got people like Captain America that represent, a certain worldview and the principles of liberty and democracy. Write a story about that.
Yeah, and who knows?
Enjoy a story about that.
Yeah, and who knows? Hundreds of years from now, someone else would take inspiration from that character, and the whole thing repeat all over again until we're worshipping at the cult of the mighty Bob Kane. Here's hoping not. And I think that's where we're going to end it. I don't know about you, Capers, but I learned a lot. Thank you very much, Mr. the Bard, for joining us.
You're welcome.
It's been really informative. And if you enjoyed this show, please tell your friends. Shout it from the rooftops. We want to get the word out. If you haven't already, go back and listen to some of our other brilliant episodes. Recently we talked with Chelsea Slotton about the history of female superheroes throughout history. Go back and check that one if you want another history lesson. You can listen to the show on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or at aplacetohangyourcape.com. We have a Patreon. Check out the rewards. We're featured on there. You might want to check us out. You never know. If you want to get in touch with us, suggest show topics, or maybe you want to come on the show yourself, like Mr. the Bard, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at AP2HYC. Thank you very much to Dan Harris for our logo, that lovely microphone with the red and blue glasses. Those are mine. And this has been PodCapers, the official podcast of A Place to Hang Your Cape. Cue the music!